Hello, everyone. Today we're having a conversation with a very dear guest, Dr. Sivaniya Subramaniapillai, who will be sharing with us today a little bit of her trajectory, as well as we're going to highlight one of her most recent scientific publications entitled Sex and Gender in Health Research, Intersectionality Matters. And she published this paper in January 2024 together with her team. Welcome, Sivaniya, from now on.
Welcome. Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, Dr. Brignoni.
Of course, and we are very delighted that we're going to be learning directly from the first author what is this research, which I consider very critical, and I know for a fact that our communities will really enjoy learning about it, since we don't often talk about it. But as a first step, I believe that our community will love to learn who's the scientist behind not only these publications, but the many other publications and scientific projects you've either spearheaded or you've collaborated in. So what about if we start by learning your trajectory from primarily a professional perspective, let's say from high school or undergraduate onwards to the present, but because we are human above all, please also share with us any personal aspect in your trajectory that also may have influenced or modified your trajectory that lets you professionally to where you are nowadays.
Yeah, okay. Well, I would say my trajectory really started in Sri Lanka. So I was born in Sri Lanka during the Civil War, and my parents fled to Canada because the war was raging, and it was safer to flee to a safer country. And so I grew up in Canada with the experience of that. And I think to some extent, when I think about my career trajectory up to now, it's fascinating to think about how that's really shaped in subtle ways my professional career, because I've learned through my research that a lot of your sort of childhood experiences and can really shape how you end up, how your brain develops, how you make choices in life. And it's really fascinating to sort of think about how childhood experiences, the social environment can influence the trajectory you end up going. And that's really fascinated me in my research career. As for my professional trajectory, I did most of my training in Toronto. So I completed a neuroscience degree at the University of Toronto. And I went on to McGill University, where I completed my master's and PhD. And I'm currently in Lausanne, Switzerland, where I'm fulfilling a postdoctoral scholarship or fellowship here. And my research is focused on really understanding individual differences and how that influences brain health and aging trajectories. And so one thing that I'm really interested in, our lab is really interested in, is understanding sex differences and gender differences and how that may influence risk in relation to brain health and aging trajectories.
Amazing, Sivaniya. Thank you so much for already laying the foundation for a lot of what we're going to be talking today with our community as well, for them to learn about brain health, and even more so your focus on teasing apart two terms that what really led me to your research and connected us is that sex and gender are two terms that typically get confused and intertwined. And I love that your work, your scientific work, tries to tease it apart and showcase not only the differences between them, but also how they are interconnected and why it's important in the context of health and even more so brain health to understand both factors. But before we continue navigating more on your research, thank you for sharing your trajectory, but a lot of the details, we need to break them down a little bit because our community may not be familiarized with what is the life and professional trajectories of a scientist. And maybe also if we have a young girl watching this lovely conversation, this may serve as another role model or example of opportunities that she may not have been exposed. For example, when I was growing up, I didn't have roles. Of course, science was practice in my coursework in the school. We did scientific fairs and so on. But as a professional pathway, and even more so for women, and the diversity that we have in science wasn't necessarily showcased. So stepping back and breaking down a little bit both the personal facts that you shared with us as well as the academic ones, in which year did you move to Canada specifically, and at what age? And with that, I'm trying to showcase also how we all get irrigated by cultural influences, but also, as you brought up, different striking events in our lives that can influence us for a traumatic trajectory, or mark us for a positive one, or an intertwine. And a little bit to speak more how that motivated or not. I'm not sure yet if that's what motivated your pathway. And then up to undergrad. So a lot of our population also, I know that you mentioned that you did a degree, I believe in neuroscience is what you said, in Toronto. But to break it a bit more, what led you to that? And for our audience, mainly in the United States, that it may be called differently, it's what we call the undergraduate degree, right after high school, right? So what motivated you to pursue an undergraduate degree in neuroscience?
Yeah, so I think I'd have to say I've always been fascinated by human psychology. So when I was a young kid, so just to answer your earlier question, we moved when I was 5 years old. So I was quite young, and I don't remember anything about the war myself, but I do remember stories that my parents have shared with me. And I also, I think, remember obviously a lot more growing up in Toronto and sort of the struggles that my parents faced in a new country with a language that they were unfamiliar with. And just sort of this immigrant life that maybe is not represented in neuroscience research or in health research in general. And so so there was a spark in me, even at a young age, when I was wondering about whether or not people like my family, whether or not people like my parents are actually reflected in the science that I was learning about as a young student. So that was sort of a little motivation. But I think the thing that really pushed me, if I have to be honest, into a degree in neuroscience is really the books that I was reading. So I read a lot of books about just there were just books about people with different stories, and I really liked to learn about like human psychology through the stories that I was reading. And I think that sort of was a little spark in me that was like, okay, I kind of really want to study psychology and neuroscience, how the brain works, why people behave the way that they behave. And so that really inspired me to pursue a degree in neuroscience. And then I realized, like in my degree, that people, there's sort of these typical trajectories and there are atypical trajectories. In aging, for example, this would be Alzheimer's disease, where it's a neurodegenerative condition that basically steals your sense of who you are, right? And so this is very fascinating, at least from a scientific perspective, in the sense of, okay, this is a disease that takes away your essence, the person who you think you are. And I think trying to understand why that is from a biological perspective, but also from a social perspective, really drove me into the sort of long-term research trajectory I ended up pursuing. I know you asked me a few other questions, so I don't know if I answered at least some of them, but feel free to repeat some of your questions as well.
Of course, no, you totally addressed them all. Thank you so much. And they keep inspiring me / triggering new questions. I'm a questions machine in general, which is great to become a scientist. It's all about curiosity and making questions. And the next one that came to mind is, it's a question and also a comment and even anecdotal experience, right? We are colleagues and we have similarities in pathway, but also very differences as a function of where we did the degrees, what are the opportunities. For example, for me, it was fascinating that you had the opportunity as an undergrad already, like coming out of high school, to actually pursue a degree in neuroscience, which for many is considered the 21st century biomedical science. And not everybody has that opportunity, including myself. For example, if you had that interest, The options typically will be either an undergraduate in psychology or biology or other ones, and then at graduate level, you will pursue either a master's or PhD and so on. But in your case, you had the opportunity. And also, I guess my question, that was more of the anecdotal comment and comparison of different systems and opportunities. But the questions, brief question to follow is, you kept mentioning that you had this interest both in psychology and neuroscience on one end to understand human behavior, and you hinted at more of a psychology interest, but then also how the brain operates and the typical versus atypical trajectories, and you hinted more at neuroscience. But my understanding is that your undergraduate program that you had available, your location was in neuroscience, correct? It wasn't psychology or neuroscience or both. It was neuroscience.
Yeah, so the specialist degree was in neuroscience. I had a double minor. One was in psychology and one was in physiology. So
great. So you did like the triangle. Great. I just wanted to know, because people, at least at the graduate level, then, right?
Yeah.
The conundrum that I have, the debate was like, do you continue through psychology or do you continue through neuroscience, and which training and therefore which knowledge you get from each one, and the applications and the pathways of it. So in your case, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I just want to say I can understand how that could be really confusing in terms of which trajectory to follow, especially since, from my perspective, both disciplines are complementary. It's sort of like, what level do you want to maybe pursue your personal path? And for me, at least from what I remember of my undergraduate experience at the University of Toronto, is there was a lot of courses that overlapped between, like, for example, the psychology minor that I took and the neuroscience specialist program that I took. So, for example, one course could easily go towards your psychology minor or your neuroscience specialist program. I think that just shows how much of an overlap there is between the disciplines.
Correct. Yeah. And then when you transition to master's and PhD, question again, coming from someone trained in the United States system, academic systems, in your case in Canada, because you didn't go to Europe until the postdoc, correct? So
That's
master's
right, yeah.
and PhD were also in Canada. So your master's and PhD were degrees that you also had aligned, like, okay, this is just the pathway? Or is that first you were like, okay, I'm completing my undergraduate, did you take a time in between, or you were straight to the master's? And what was the motivation to master's? Is it because that is, again, the pathway to follow, or you were not sure to follow a PhD and you wanted that PhD degree also later?
Right. I'd have to say that when I started my undergraduate degree, to be honest, I don't even think I knew that like a PhD program like existed. It's a bit weird to say that because I was taking like neuroscience courses by professors who had PhDs, but I didn't put two and two together. I just thought they were like, professors or teachers who were like, helping me get my degree. But I didn't have a full appreciation of what this PhD process was. And obviously part of that is because I am like a first generation PhD. And so you mentioned earlier, not having a sort of a close community where you can kind of rely on that information. It's not really firsthand knowledge to someone like myself, where I'm kind of just like figuring it out on the go. So I have to admit, when I started my degree, it was just for the purpose of like, okay, it seemed like the natural next step after high school. And I like neuroscience. I'm going to follow my passion. And to be honest, I'm not sure I fully had a deep appreciation for my degree, while at least in sort of the main aspect of my program, in the sense of like taking courses, taking exams. It was more when I sort of had this opportunity to do some lab work that I was like, oh, this is for me.
During undergrad.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate because I was able to do research in 3 or 4 different labs during my undergraduate degree. And, I think this is what really informed me that this is what I want to pursue. And then through this work, through working as a research intern in different labs did I realize, or did I learn about what it means to be a PhD, that this is a possibility to pursue and that I wanted to pursue it. And so I'm very, very grateful for sort of pursuing these research internships during my undergraduate degree, because that's where I learned that this is possibly the path for me.
Agreed. Totally empathize and resonate. But also our population, our community may not know what are internships, so what are those research opportunities that you face, that you encountered during your undergraduate degree. So could you please share with us a bit when, let's say by year, in which year of your undergraduate you even learned that you could do research? Because again, I empathize. When I started undergrad, something that I did know about PhD, but what for sure I didn't know is just that from undergraduate stages, you could do research at different depths or responsibilities. And even less, I knew that you could have paid research opportunities. I'm not sure if yours were paid or not, or some of them. I did both, voluntary and paid. But I would love for you to share with our community when in your undergraduate degree you learned that you could do research, and then how did you do that step? Did you just sign up to the first available lab, or you interview in different ones? You did it by topic or by opportunity, basically?
Oh, it's a great question. I'm trying to remember. So for the first question, I did have my first research internship the first summer of my first year of undergrad. So I would say quite soon after I started my undergraduate degree. In terms of the sort of strategy that I used, to be honest, I was more interested in the opportunity to work in a lab. So it wasn't so much that it was a topic that interested me, but it was just that I was desperate to get in because
that's how most of us start. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I think
so you may have seen an advertisement, back in the day, those old times flyers that you pick,
right.
the little paper, we are looking for a research assistant, an undergraduate in neuroscience or psychology. So it may have been something like that for you.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it was just like
so it's not like you proactively search for something that then you found out that you could do search. It was mostly like somewhere in the environment, likely your university environment, you ran into that opportunity.
Exactly.
Which is the case of many trajectories, and I empathize with that.
Yeah, so I think it was just more seeing what opportunities were out there. I did do a lot of like Googling as well, but again, it wasn't very intentional. Like it wasn't very like an active, this is the person I want. It has to be this person.
If you don't how people say, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yes, exactly.
And if you didn't know that this was even an opportunity, how will you look out for it?
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing that experience with you, which then my understanding is that given this research, and we can assume that then after the first one, you have multiple research undergraduate opportunities. What was the leap or transition or decision for getting a master's? By that time, did you know also that you wanted to then follow up with a PhD, or you didn't? Or is it that in Canada, is it required as a pathway to do that step by step?
Yeah, in Canada,
and then a PhD.
Right. So it's funny because I didn't really have a lot of faith that I would get into like a PhD program, and to be honest, my grades weren't the best actually for when I was completing my undergraduate degree as well. So I didn't apply to too many PhD programs in Canada. I actually only applied to one school, which was McGill University, and I believe also one program, like one lab. And so I was very lucky in the sense that I got accepted into the program and into the lab that I was there was this co-supervision, so into the two labs that I was seeking the acceptance from. But yeah, in terms of the question was the process, the leap.
The masters, and I asked, for example, in my case, given where I trained, the master's is not a requirement. It's kind of like what you were hinting at, is what some people get if they need to, let's say, boost up their credentials for their PhD application.
Yes.
But for example, in Europe, we share here with our community that may not be familiarized. My colleagues that train in academia in the European system, to do not be absolutist, I'm gonna say that most of them, if it's not the case of all, it's different. It's more like a tendency that you do an undergraduate and a master's together. And that's kind of like the 5 years. It's like all in one, unless you're doing more of an associate that is 3 years or a technical degree. And then that's why the PhD is, when you apply, my understanding is, and in most cases, is the research. It's already with the lab. You commit to a lab and you do your PhD, 3, 4, 5 years of research, even 2.5, without much or any coursework, as compared in the US, that actually you can jump, as I did, from the undergraduate to a PhD program if technically you qualify with everything. All this to say that the master's, at least for these programs, is not a requirement. What is more of a requirement is that you have very strong grades in specific courses relevant to that discipline. Of course, your essays, letters of recommendations, and as well your research experiences during undergrad. But as you said, a lot of people that don't believe that they have enough in their application will go for a master's. So then it's another boost in their CV. Or they may apply directly to the PhD, didn't get in, but in some schools, they suggest them, hey, you didn't make it to the PhD, but you can enter into our master's degree.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's why I was asking in your context in Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just as you're saying it, I'm realizing there definitely is so many different possibilities. If in my case, it was a master's PhD program, and I believe that was the only option, at least available to me. So from what I understood, I would start off with my master's, and I had the option to, like the first or second year, or I think it was the second year of my master's, as I was completing it, I had the option of taking the work that I had done from my master's into, transitioning into a PhD kind of thing. So instead of completing the master's and starting a PhD, I could just take the work into the PhD. And so that's actually that was like a nice little option, I think, for students, because you get the chance to realize if this work is for you. And if it is, that's great. You could take it with you to your PhD as the first study, for example, of your PhD, and sort of let go of the master's. Or if you're realizing midway through your first study that maybe this work isn't for me, or this pathway isn't for me, you just finish it up with the master's and you still get a degree. So I really liked that possibility, especially for someone like myself. I didn't really know if this was for me. And so it's a nice idea to know that you're not finishing a program, but they're not getting a degree as well. So in my case, I really still like the research the second year of my master's, but I chose to still finish my master's and start a PhD. So I had a study for my master's that was published. And then when I started my PhD, I also wanted a different, sort of pursue a different project idea as well. So I decided to start from scratch with my PhD, but in the same lab. So I got both my master's and PhD out of it, but you can kind of choose depending on what works best for you.
That's great. And this program that is master's and PhD, which makes me think on the MD PhD, which is a whole other conversation and type of title, but I'm not so familiarized. And it's great to learn that in your context, it's not like US, it's not like Europe, which are like my typical comparisons, but of course there are so many other ways of training across the world. And in your case in Canada, you're saying that, and it was a program that will be entitled, is a master's PhD in neuroscience, or it was like in a broader
so it was
field or in psychology?
So the program name was experimental psychology. There's also McGill offers a neuroscience program as well. It's the integrated program in neuroscience, and I do believe in that program, which is offered by a different department, there is a possibility to go straight into a PhD. Whereas with
we're in the Department of Psychology.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of goes back to your earlier question of like choosing between psychology and neuroscience. And I remember at the time I was speaking with my co-supervisors, and I felt like, I actually want to take the integrative program. I wanted to take the neuroscience, path. And they actually advised me that actually you're going to get the same sort of teaching, like you're working in the same lab and as other students who are in the neuroscience department, for example. But what I learned was that, for example, the psychology department offered the possibility for students to be teaching assistants. And so, whereas the neuroscience department, it was very hard to get work as a teaching assistant. So it was interesting to think about it this way, because you're still getting that neuroscience training. I was still getting the same neuroscience training as other students in the neuroscience department, but I got these sort of other benefits of being in the psychology department. So I was really happy that I ended up choosing that route.
That's very interesting. That also informs to our community these nuances that can make the decision of someone pursuing a training in health-related fields that are, again, as you mentioned earlier, totally interconnected, but there's still nuances at the level of coursework, for example, or teaching opportunities, or the lab that you want. I resonate with you in a similar but also opposite way, in which, in my case, when I was in that debate, I continued through neuroscience, because to me, at least in the opportunities that I had, the coursework, the depth of training that I wanted in the nervous system, in the whole neurobiology of the human being, I wasn't gonna get it in a psychology or specifically clinical psychology program. Again, they may have a few courseworks or courses or modules that talk to each other, but the coursework that I was getting via a specific PhD in neuroscience was very thorough, from, as I tell people, from the micro to the macro of the entire nervous system, the entire neurobiology, even including dissections of brain, both humans and other species, versus in psychology, is a coursework that, at least in our environments, tend to be more focused on perhaps cognitive aspects, emotional, behavioral, which also from neuroscience you can pursue. But again, they talk to each other, but the depth of each discipline has different aims. So in your case, it seems that you in experimental psychology, or those in integrative neuroscience, for whatever reasons in your university, actually the coursework was the same, but the difference was that in psychology you had more teaching versus in neuroscience not.
Yeah, so so that's a really interesting point that you make, in the sense that in your case, you sort of pursued the type of coursework that you wanted to take. And so it made sense to take sort of this neuroscience degree. Whereas for me, like what I learned early on is that at least at McGill, I could take a lot of the courses that were offered by the neuroscience department. So I took this.
You had that freedom.
Yeah, so I took the neuroanatomy course. I took a lot of the courses that were offered by the neuroscience department. But then the other difference that I really actually, and now I appreciate more, is that the psychology department requires that students complete a lot more courses than I think was the case for the neuroscience department. So in that case, that was really helpful for me, because I really needed a lot more theoretical understanding of the brain and cognitive and psychological background as well. But also, this is where I learned the bulk of my statistical analyses. So I had no understanding of how to run statistical analyses, and this is where I really started to learn this, is through the courses that I took offered by the psychology department. And so I think it worked out really nicely, in the sense that I had the option to choose more neuroscience courses, even though I still wasn't in the neuroscience department. But then with the psychology department, it's not mandatory also to be a teaching assistant. So if you wanted to make some extra money, that option was available to you as well. And so it's nice to have a little bit more flexibility in my case.
That's great. That's great. And there's so many other difference that I cross-check in here with you and with the community. But to move along in terms of your next steps, I would love that you share with us what was, if you remember more or less, because also if you've done your PhD defense 2 years ago or more, you tend to forget a little bit, but if you can share with us what was the broader scope or the title of your dissertation, and how was your transition to your current scientific position, which is your postdoc fellowship. And our community may not be familiarized on what is a postdoc, what does that mean? So if you can share with us both, like the wrap up in terms of topic, what you put out there for the world, thanks to your lofty PhD dissertation, and how did that transition you both topic-wise, lab-wise, motivations to your current status as a postdoc, and what even a postdoc is, and why did you make it?
Yeah, okay. So I completed my PhD in Dr. Natasha Raja's lab at McGill University. She's currently actually in Toronto. She's at the Toronto Metropolitan University. My research focus was really on understanding sex differences in brain and cognitive health. And so throughout my PhD, I sort of, my research was to really investigate how men and women differ in terms of their brain neurocorrelates as they, for example, complete an episodic memory task. And then also there was the structural component, the brain structure, how men and women differ in terms of brain structure as well. And so really to try to understand how men and women age differently. But then through this research, I got really interested in how, for example, not just individual differences like sex influences brain health, but other sort of risk and lifestyle factors influence cognitive and brain health. And so for one of my last studies of my PhD, I got into, so I was working with a sample that was based in Montreal that had, for example, a family history of Alzheimer's disease, and with subsample participants that had also this genetic risk for Alzheimer's. So it's called ApoE. So having a genetic risk for Alzheimer's, you might have a copy of this E4 allele or two copies of this. So I was really interested in seeing whether these risk factors sort of work differently in men compared to women, and how that might influence their brain health, brain and cognitive health. And so this is sort of, I started my PhD sort of understanding the sex differences in brain health at sort of this broad level, but then trying to understand, but then why are we seeing these sex differences? And could, for example, risk and lifestyle factors influence brain health differently in men compared to women? And so this was sort of my overall sort of PhD research. And the transition between my PhD and postdoc was actually quite, I would say, smooth, in the sense that in my last year of PhD, I got a scholarship from the Canadian government, so it's the NSERC, that would give me a chance to work in a lab, in any lab that I choose, for 2 months, 1 or 2 months. And so while I was deciding on which lab to choose, I was finishing up one of my last PhD studies, and the study actually involved a new method that I was just learning about. It's called brain age, and so the idea is to use machine learning to predict a participant's age just based on their MRI scans. And the idea is the algorithm will give you a number, and if the number is older than their actual age, then you know their brain age is older than their actual age. And if the predicted age is younger or lower than their actual age, you know that their brain age is younger than their actual age. And so I was really learning this new technique, and there was a lot of like new things that I couldn't really ask my lab about because it's not a method that we were familiar with. And so I was reading up on a lot of papers, and one author that I came across several times in my research was my current supervisor. And so I was quite nervous because I had this burning question about a methodological query that was really bothering me. And so I was like, you know what, I'm just going to email her and see if she responds, just a cold email. And so I spent a lot of time crafting an email and sent it out to Dr. Anne-Marie DeLong. And the next day she responded, and I was so excited because, you know, sometimes these cold emails, you don't really get a response, especially since these authors typically are super busy, and it can be tough to respond, you know. So I was so excited to see that she responded, and we just kept in communication. And then I thought, well, I have this scholarship, and it would be really cool if I can use it to visit her in Lausanne. And so it worked out really nicely in the sense that the last summer of my PhD, I visited Lausanne to work with Anne-Marie, and I had such a great time that when I had a postdoc opportunity to come back to Switzerland, I took it. And so that's kind of how I ended up transitioning into a postdoc. And to answer your question about what a postdoc is, so this is typically some additional training after a PhD. And this is a great opportunity for researchers to change different labs, change different countries if they wish to, although there is some controversy about changing different countries. It could be hard to do if you have a family or if you have responsibilities that make it difficult to travel. But it is, in principle, an opportunity to broaden your skills. In my case, I was working with smaller samples, and I really wanted to broaden my skills to learn how to apply these sort of machine learning algorithms to more population-based data sets. And so this was sort of my motivation to continue working with Anne-Marie to develop my skills from that front. And so typically a postdoc lasts 2 to 3 years, but that can also vary. Yeah, I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for this thorough explanation of that trajectory and transition from the PhD, the postdoc, and how it showcases that a lot of it goes beyond the interest in terms of your research topics, but also the networks, the relationship, the human foundation as a social species, that it was a mix of, you had a need, in this case a methodological one, but it could have been of country, as you said, for whatever reason you want to try another country, so let me see what is out there. In your case, you got this exposure that led you to more questions, but your current lab had a ceiling in terms of that methodological opportunity, and that promoted you or pushed you to search out there, which is also the nature of science, and that also make you push your boundaries of, or your fears, I will say, of sometimes when we are younger in our career, we see more established principal investigators or full professors as unreachable people or intimidating, and I love that you shared how you surpassed that fear because your questioning or your interest was larger. Plus, you capitalized also on opportunities that were available in your country, like these fellowships, to meet up all this as an additional training in your pathway. So it's fascinating for me. And in this context, I would love now to deep dive more in your recently published manuscript in January 2024. And by recently, I mean anything that happened in the last 5 years. I think science is recent. At most, you can stretch it to 10 years, but I would love that we start by you sharing in your own knowledge and terms, briefly clarify for our community what is sex, what is gender, and after you briefly clarify that distinction, that you also tell us why both non-scientific community members as well as members of the scientific community, researchers, tend to get these two terms mixed up, and why this misunderstanding is problematic in health research.
Yeah, so so sex and gender are interlinked concepts, but they are distinct, and I believe that it's important to make a distinction between these different concepts because it can enable us researchers to pursue more rigorous science, which is at the end of the day everyone's goal. And so sex refers to the biological aspects of an individual. So that could mean their chromosomes, their hormones, as well as their reproductive anatomy, whereas gender encompasses the social cultural aspect of an individual. So that that includes their gender identity, their social roles, and how they're treated essentially based on how they identify as and how they're sort of so how they are treated in a society and their social roles essentially. So the way that I see it is sort of like this biological component in reference to sex, and then the social cultural aspect is in reference to gender, as well as an individual's gender identity. And so it is important to distinguish, because there is some like many studies that show that both biology and social cultural aspect of an individual does influence their health outcomes. And so from a sort of a policy intervention perspective, when we're thinking about optimizing brain health, for example, it's kind of important to understand what part of someone's health may be influenced by their biology, what part of their health might be influenced by this sort of gender. But with that being said, I think one thing that makes it really difficult to investigate sex and gender is that they're really closely intertwined, as you mentioned. And so disentangling the effects of sex and the effects of gender is really tough to do, especially from a methodological perspective. And so there's several techniques that are being investigated right now to try to distinguish these two concepts. But I think one thing that makes it difficult in terms of even in research is sort of to disentangle the two concepts when they're so closely intertwined. Now, to give maybe an example to sort of make this a little bit more clear.
That was my next question to you. Yes, how, if you could share with us some key examples from your research where this intersectional approach has revealed disparities that traditional models might be overlooking or have overlooked.
Absolutely, yeah. So one key example, so for example, in our work, I'm really interested in healthy aging as well as risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. But just to take the example of Alzheimer's disease, this is a neurodegenerative disease that, but in this case, women around the world there's a greater prevalence of women with Alzheimer's disease than men. And so there are sex differences in the progression of the disease. And then also once diagnosed, the how men and women fare is also quite different when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. And so right off the bat, just looking at these statistics, it tells us that there's something that's going on very differently between men and women that makes it important for us to understand the role of sex, but then also the role of gender. And so when we talk about, for example, why it might be interesting to investigate sex differences. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, ApoE4, ApoE is a gene that is implicated in Alzheimer's disease, and individuals with the genetic risk for Alzheimer's, so having one or two copies of the E4 allele, have a significantly greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to those that don't have one or both of the alleles. And also I just want to say that just because you have a copy or both copies, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get it. It just increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's. So it's very important, I think, to highlight that. But also, so this is sort of the biological component where a lot of studies have also shown that women with the E4 risk allele, the progression of the disease is far worse than men with the E4 allele. And so this is where biology, sex differences in biology is very fascinating. It's very important to explicitly investigate how males may differ from females when it comes to E4 genetics. And so that's just one example of biology. There's also several other examples that I'm sure we can discuss, but I think that's a very clear example of showing that. But then when it comes to gender, For example, I think the best way to sort of get into this is the example of caregiving. So caregiving is what we would call a gender-related variable. And this is because women around the world tend to take on greater responsibilities of caregiving. So that could be for their children, that could be for elderly relatives. It's just a disproportionate burden of responsibility that's placed on women. Now, this in itself is not an issue at all, especially if this is how responsibilities are divvied up in the household. But it can be especially stressful and challenging for women if they're also taking on professional responsibilities and other responsibilities, if they're sort of taking on this sort of increased responsibilities of caregiving. And so increased stress as a result of greater caregiving responsibilities or disproportionate amount of caregiving can increase your risk of chronic conditions, including worse cardiometabolic health, as well as increased risk of cognitive decline and other sort of issues, as well as dementia. And so this is, I think, a very clear example of how this gender-related variable of caregiving, where women around the world, on average, are expected to take on more responsibilities, can impact their health, especially when women are putting a lot more time on caregiving. Then that means that they can't really take time for themselves to engage in physical activity or pursue social activities that are all sort of beneficial for better brain health and reduced or decreased risk of Alzheimer's, for example. And I'm saying all this just to sort of paint a picture of why it's important to investigate sex as well as gender when it comes to diseases such as Alzheimer's disease.
I love it. Thank you so much. And I will make sure that we pause in here to sort of rehash it, because it may be a lot for our community that are not even familiarized with the ins and outs of research, but also about this minutia at the level of concepts, and then how these concepts are seen in the real world, but also how in science we look at them as factor and what they matter. And I believe that you did a great job explaining that. But if I may sort of rehash it, and please correct me, I want to make sure that the community understand that, at least in my book, I see sets as female, male. And also we can open the conversation that we haven't mentioned here. And I will be intrigued to see if in your research you guys have accounted at some point for intersex populations, in which also at the biological level, they have also their own different profiles, I would say, and how you distinguish also gender. And when people ask, okay, what are those labels? Because people tend to say woman, man, female, male, and mixing everything. When I like to try to bring people, okay, sets, then female, male, intersex, versus gender, you can have woman, men, and so on, different genders that in society we use. Will you agree that at least for our community, they can at least, if they can walk away with some clear distinction, will you agree that they can see more, as you said, the biological components and all the predispositions or tendencies or behaviors that come with our biological aspects, including our neurobiology, in interconnection with our hormonal systems and other biological systems, as compared to gender, which I don't know if you will agree, but also carries a more psychological and sociocultural aspect to it in this identity, as you said, but also I would say not only sociocultural, but sociopolitical and socioeconomic aspect, as you were bringing with your example of caregiving, which was a wonderful one, in which my understanding from this example is that you were trying to convey is that these negative brain health outcomes, or health outcomes in general, that we are seeing, starting with elevated stress in female, that can later debunk in Alzheimer's or all sorts of compromises to their brain health, have been found in research, coming not necessarily for their biological foundation or predispositions, but from the gender, the assumptions or roles assumed in their culture and society with their gender.
Exactly.
Will you agree that that's how our community can walk away understanding these two concepts?
Yeah, I would say that's a really good a good distillation of what we discussed. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Sets of policies and practice.
Mm,
We've been, or at least people like you and your colleagues, scientists
mm,
like you and your team, have been doing work trying to emphasize that sex and gender are
mhm,
distinct, and also how they intersect, how do they integrate with each other.
mhm,
However, we can uh, affirm that there's still a gap in an actual implementation of, right, like
mhm,
how we bring this amazing research that you all are putting out there to
mhm,
actual practice, because at
mhm.
least personally, the practice, the application is what really drives me. And one of
Yeah.
my frustration through my scientific trajectory has been that, due to multiple factors that it's part of another conversation, I would say that often the research, even more so the research related to healthcare and anything related to human experience to be applied, stays just on the paper, stays just in the walls of the
Yeah.
academia or whomever is doing
Yeah.
the research, and takes forever or never to get into actual application. And not only application, but an application that leads to positive outcomes.
Yeah.
What, therefore, would you say are the biggest barriers
Mm,
preventing current researchers in these fields from adopting intersectional frameworks in their studies, but also the
mhm.
people that need to apply these? What will you say, if you can share briefly, if
Yeah.
you're aware of some barriers, in your opinion, that are preventing this
Mm,
connection from research to application
yeah.
for these topics?
Mhm. Well, we talked about sex and gender. I don't think we talked about sort of intersectionality, which is quite a bit big term, but just sort of
Correct.
for viewers who are unfamiliar with the term, intersectionality is this a concept that we all constitute multiple identity dimensions, not just sex and gender, and it's important to sort of consider sort of this holistic aspect of an individual as it relates, for example, in our case, health outcomes. So it's not just about understanding an individual's sex and gender, but it's also about understanding, for example, their socioeconomic status, their educational background, and other sort of variables that may interact in very complex ways to influence their health outcome. Essentially, the way that I see it is really trying to understand the human for who they are and see how that might be influencing their health, their brain health outcomes, for example. And In terms of the barriers, I think so. A lot of my research right now really focuses on data sets that are already available. So, for example, one of the data sets that our lab uses quite a bit is the UK Biobank, which is about one of the world's largest brain imaging data set. So it has 500,000 participants in this biobank, and we have a lot of health information about individuals. And so the biobank, these participants are all from the United Kingdom, and a sort of a startling statistic is that 96% of participants in the sample are white Caucasian, whereas so that means that 4%, the remaining 4% represent ethnic minorities. But then if you look at the makeup of ethnic minorities in the UK, that's about 20%. And so there's quite a bit of disparity, even in the data sets that we're using, these public data sets available to researchers in terms of the representation of the country that we're taking the samples from, right? So I think one major question as scientists, and something that I've been asking even in my research, is I think it's really important to think about whether or not the samples that we're using, is it actually representative of the country that we're taking the sample from? Never mind like other countries, but just even if like, Canada is quite a diverse population. And I have wondered whether now that I think about it, doing my PhD research, whether or not it was actually representative of the actual makeup of the Canadian population, And so I think that as researchers, we really have to start probing that question and asking whether or not we're doing sort of the due diligence to ensure that there are more representative samples in our research group. And even if that's not the case, I think just being transparent about it when we're reporting the samples in for example the demographics of participants, just to be transparent, and but I totally resonate with what you said in terms of this idea that we as scientists, we tend to publish our work, which is great and very rewarding, but it's very unfortunate that the science sort of stops there from the published paper. Yeah, we might go to some conferences to present our research, but
with your own colleagues.
That's right. We're still speaking with
that.
Yes, exactly. We're not really speaking to the people that we're doing the work for. And so I think for me, I've always sort of been an advocate of engaging in science communication activities as much as possible. So throughout my PhD.
And that's why we are here.
That's why we're here. Yes. So yeah, throughout my PhD and throughout even my postdoc, I have really tried my best to try to speak to diverse audiences. I think part of it is that one of the barriers is that there's just a lack of trust from, especially from more diverse communities who have historically been who've been targeted by researchers in science and mistreated as well in very explicit cases as well, especially in the United States. And so there is a very understandable mistrust from diverse populations. And so trying to address that and speak with community members and break the barriers between the scientific silo and the community. I think that's a very important step just to make sure that there's better crosstalk. What do you think about that?
I think so many things, and I'm constantly affirming and wanting to do part 2, part 3, part 4 of our conversation, because when we debunk all that you've shared, makes me on one end confirm a lot of also the changes in my pathway, including like if you're driven by seeing actual application for the good in the world, the current infrastructure that typically scientists have, the higher up you get, the least you can make it, not even because you don't want it, but because the duties that you're tasked with or the demands, right? Time is finite. Absolutely. And then how maybe if we're gonna keep having scientists being tasked with all these demands, how then we should develop programs that may not even depend on the government. Like we need to get creative in here as a society to start bridging more, and that also doesn't stop in communication, but also in application. And I foresee a future where, regardless if it's from the government, private sector, nonprofits, and so on, that there will be more intersectionality of taking this research and doing the best we can to apply it. But also a couple of thoughts that got triggered with your comments about also the research representation at the sample level. I don't know if we've been in many conferences, and you may have come across with a typical speaker that is giving the research talk and saying, when they get to the section of talking who were their samples or participants, they're like, well, and it was typical undergraduates. But then in the papers, we call them adults, or we call them people in general.
Right.
But we've, by now, at least many of us scientists in these fields, either neuroscience or psychology or any human research fields, have been more open to acknowledge that, we cannot only be doing this big question. I'm not saying if it's Alzheimer's, that wouldn't apply, but there are so many questions that are intended to be generalized of the human experience. But when you look at the samples over and over, are humans between 18 and 22 years old. That's it.
Yes,
and it has become even a joke. That shouldn't be a joke, but it's a joke that because depending upon where you're in the world, typically these research projects are paid, and also in universities, that's the largest sample that you tend to have. Then we recruit undergraduate students. But I agree with you that we need to, both as a scientific community and also potential participants out there in the world, to start communicating more. On one end, researchers need to maybe undo a lot of damage that has happened to promote that trust that you addressed earlier on. And also for the community to understand that we need to participate, we need to engage in science if we want our knowledge to keep improving and expanding. You may have gone through the process as I have done. It's recruitment for research participants is hard.
Yes,
Mainly depending
absolutely.
upon the question, the more niche it becomes or complex or pathology or so on, it's very challenging and totally there are reasons why people are concerned. But how we can foster an environment that is more of trust, so society also understand that without them, we cannot have the best representation and therefore generalize what we're finding. So sort of to wrap up, I'm gonna put together these two questions and feel free to file them in order or to integrate them or freestyle or switch them. But to wrap up our conversation, I would like that you share with our communities topics more related to clinical and real world applications. Specifically, how can the insights from your work up to now can influence, for example, medical training or healthcare policy, or even the individual patient care? And second, and lastly, but very important, more the typical future direction. You know that in our scientific life, everything is future directions, next steps. So I would love that you wrap up not only sharing with us what are the insights that from your work will influence or could influence medical training, healthcare policy, or even individual patient care, but also that you wrap up sharing with us what is your burning question at the moment or the one that you're hoping to tackle next whenever you're wrapping up whatever you're doing right now.
Yeah, okay. Okay, yes. Well, I think for the first question, so how this work can potentially inform policy and just sort of health interventions, if I'm understanding correctly. I think, at least with this paper that is the focus of this discussion, what is sort of overlooked is the sort of the individual behind whatever disease that we're studying. And so I think it's just sort of important. Obviously, biology is very important and is in what's going on inside the individual, but who that individual is and their life experiences, as well as identity dimensions that could also help us better understand how the disease is manifesting in them. And so I think that's sort of the most sort of important thing, I think, from this paper in terms of intervention, at least that I've taken, and especially since when you think about even something like Alzheimer's disease, it's a very heterogeneous condition. And so it can manifest differently in different individuals. And so that really tells us that obviously biology has a huge role in this, but that also individual differences influence a significant proportion of this as well, and trying to understand their background, their lifestyle experiences, their lifestyle choices, how that influences their disease risk. It can really help us work, I think, towards sort of this personalized intervention in medicine. And so I think for me, that's sort of the biggest takeaway when it comes to at least this paper that we discussed on understanding intersectionality. And sorry, your second question was about
your future directions. Either what is your current burning question that you're cooking in your current lab that it's building either from the publication that we've been focusing today, or is it just a segue or a new direction, or what is the question that will be coming up next if you're not currently building up a new project?
Yeah, I see. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I think my current ambitions are to really try to address some of the work, some of the, sort of this paper that we've written at a theoretical level about, you know, we're talking about how it's very important to investigate multiple identity dimensions, the individual, and how that influences brain health and risk for Alzheimer's disease. So in the future, it would be really great for me if I could work on this project at a concrete level. So try to recruit more diverse participants. I think this involves obviously collaborating with scientists around the world so that we can work together and work on sort of more diverse populations, work with bigger numbers, and try to actually investigate these questions of intersectionality and how that influences brain health outcomes. I think one sort of barrier that in terms of understanding intersectionality is we just don't have a lot of variation in these data sets, right? So it's not just sex and gender, but it's also socioeconomic status. It's also, life experiences. So I think it's just trying to work a little bit more collaboratively with other researchers to pull data sets together so that we can really tackle these questions in the first place. So that's like, that would be my dream goal, is to sort of work towards that in a more concrete way. I think just sort of maybe to leave people on something that I've been thinking a lot about, and especially after having written this paper with my colleagues, is really just how, obviously lifestyle choices play a significant proportion in terms of our health outcomes and our risk for developing age-related conditions. So this could be, physical activity, stress, all these sort of factors that, we talk a lot about in terms of trying to improve, to maintain not only our general health, but our brain health as well. But I think it's really important to also think about how, like, the environment is set up to influence our health outcomes. I think for me, that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. It's not just about the individual and what they choose, but about how, like, we are set up as a society, as a community, to make it easier or harder to work towards sort of this better brain health. And I think that's something that's really important to think about. And just, it's not just about, like, for example, the example that I gave with caregiving, it's not just about, trying to disperse the responsibilities between spouses more evenly, but it's about, for example, having, for example, in Switzerland, which is where I'm based, women get 14 weeks, I think, of maternity leave, but men, I think, get 2 weeks. And so, like, we're not even, like, encouraging, like, men to, like, to be there for their family, their new family, right? So I think it's important to be really understanding of how, like, these systemic structures are in place to sort of maybe make it harder. And then also at the individual level, also to maybe just question our biases, right? Like gender norms and gender biases that may make it harder for us to work towards more optimal brain health.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Sivaniya, because now I feel that we will have to do part 2 very soon, and probably with one of your more recent papers, because number one, this concept of intersectionality that you and your colleagues are bringing to the table is critical, in the sense that, as we've talked, we have these biological predispositions, we have these more psychological or sociocultural predispositions, but as you're saying, not only they're distinct, but they totally talk to each other, and there are many other factors that we want to bring to the table to have a holistic perspective of the individual as an individual, but also their health. And as you said, it's also socioeconomic status. And now my intrigue is, on one end, sort of what you touched on, and again, it will have to be the next conversation, but it's how you make it as a factor, right? Like, for example, when we do sets, well, it's very black and white. If you're only focusing, I'm not saying that is the only set test, but then you can just say, okay, female or male. But then when we enter gender, even though that we have a history of being very binary, we know it's not binary in terms of the only genders, but also it's very, like, black and white. But when you want to create, what I'm understanding with this intersectionality concept is more of a composite. Socioeconomic status is a factor that you've mentioned goes in it, and socioeconomic status in itself is a composite of different factors, such as education level of each of the parents, for example, income, or a new idea that is considered the ratio, like the needs to income ratio, something like that. Basically, it's not saying just income by income, but also what are the needs of that household. So to me, in the next conversation, we'll have to debunk even more. So maybe you can show us a table on how this idea of intersectionality that you guys are now using as apparently your factor of interest to understand these healthcare outcomes, rather than just looking at sets alone, gender alone, and on SES alone. how at the practice of science do you categorize it, right? Like if you don't know what you're measuring, if you don't have ways of measuring it, you won't get anywhere. But also not only for science, how does that translate for the application, as I've been insisting? And you mentioned how the systemic infrastructure, you can call it either the healthcare one, the educational one, and overall the society, depending upon the country, but I would say in general, really resonates with the fact that we're not living in a context that it's promoting the optimal health, including the brain health, which is what we are here talking, how we can optimize our brain health from the context of a very specific research niche. But that is very critical, both from a scientific perspective. So not only you and your lab, because if you and your lab are publishing this and your colleagues in the same field are not using this term, you won't be able to build a whole corpus of updated data. But on the other end, how healthcare professionals can also understand this new concept and apply it, and also how the systems will start seeing us as holistic individuals. So we build a society that is more human-centered, as we've been speaking, rather than patching and saying, okay, this is only because of your biology, only because of your gender, only because of this country that you live in. But more, we are humans, and how we can make the best of our research knowledge to have the best applications for healthcare. So with this, I want to wrap up and thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation for me, and I'm sure that our community will love learning both about the human being behind this amazing research, and not only her face and her name, but her pathway up to this point. Also, what moves her as an individual and as a researcher, and what are the critical key points of this research, not only to stay in papers, but in the real world. So thank you so much for teaching us so much. And I look forward to having another conversation with you in the future.
Thank you so much. It was such a delight.
Of course.